Huawei hits back. The Chinese tech giant sues the US government whilst it fights a legal battle in Canada. Why is the company so controversial, and is it a threat to global security? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. For China, Huawei is a source of national pride. It's written into the company's name. But for the US and many Western nations, the tech giant is a spying tool for the Chinese government. The US says Huawei poses a security threat and is pressuring allies in Europe and Asia to ban its products. But Huawei is fighting back. It's suing the US government for not allowing its workers to use Huawei equipment. And in Canada, the company is fighting the extradition of one of its top executives to the US. She's accused of flouting US sanctions on Iran. Our China correspondent Adrian Brown reports from Huawei's headquarters in Shenzhen.
From the air, Huawei's success is clear. Just part of its sprawling complex in the special economic zone of Shenzhen. Huawei's name literally means the achievements of China. But the Trump administration says those achievements owe more to cheating and stealing than the sort of innovation on display here. Allegations its top executives deny. On Thursday, they held a news conference inviting selected media organizations, including Al Jazeera, to confirm that Huawei has filed a lawsuit against the US government over a ban which restricts federal government employees from using its equipment.
We are left with no choice but to challenge the law in court. This ban not only to unlawful, but also harms both Huawei and US consumers.
Once more, they insisted Huawei's not in the pocket of China's government and accused the US of hacking its servers.
The US government has long branded Huawei as threat. It has hacked our servers and stolen our emails and source code.
Huawei's top officials were once like China's leaders. They rarely spoke to the foreign media. But the arrest of the firm's chief financial officer in Canada, where she's now fighting extradition to the United States, has changed all of that, and the firm has now begun an extraordinary legal and media offensive. Huawei is a success story that chimes with many Chinese people's sense of patriotism and pride. It's not clear who's behind this music video now circulating on social media, praising its smartphones. The firm insists it had nothing to do with it. Huawei is fighting another legal battle in Canada, where its chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, appeared before an extradition court on Wednesday. She's accused of breaking US sanctions and money laundering. Meng's lawyers argue her arrest was politically motivated. Huawei is trying to weather storms on many fronts. The copycat European architecture is not a theme park, but the firm's new research and development campus. The company's critics continue to argue that it's not just the buildings here that have been cloned. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Shenzhen.
Well, let's take a closer look at Huawei's history. The Shenzhen-based company was founded in 1987 by a former officer of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. He won a government contract to provide equipment to the Communist Party in the early 1990s. His company was later granted status of national champion. This effectively closed the market to foreign competition. Huawei expanded internationally in the year 2000. 5 years later, the value of its overseas sales surpassed local business. And today, it's the world's biggest supplier of network telecommunications equipment and the second largest seller of mobile phones. Well, let's bring in our guests now. And Andrew Leung is an independent China analyst and a research fellow at Beijing Normal University. He joins us via Skype from Hong Kong. In Washington, D.C., we have Richard Goodstein, a lawyer and democratic political consultant. And via Skype from Tokyo, Marc Einstein, chief analyst for digital services at ITR Japan, a technology research firm. A very warm welcome to all of you. Andrew, does Huawei have good grounds to sue the US government?
Yes, because Huawei is now feels it is subject to an 360 degrees blowback from the United States against its own reputation as the world's leading supplier of 5G infrastructure and products. Now, Huawei has achieved this position by working very diligently behind the scenes and over the past 2 decades. Winning the trust of customers in 160 countries worldwide. In fact, it is a very, very special company in the sense that, of course, not only because it has the background from the founder was a member of the PLA, but because it is now a separate company. The company, in fact, 98% of the shares are owned by its employees. And there are 170,000 employees, and 45% of these employees work on R&D. So it is a company focusing on technology, focusing on innovation, and it has managed to become the world's largest supplier of 5G infrastructure and products. I think this position is achieved through maybe the past 2 decades. It's unlikely to be achieved just by copying or stealing other people's technology.
Sure. Okay. So how much, Andrew? How much does it actually need the U.S. market?
Well, the U.S. market actually accounts for a relatively small proportion of China's worldwide market penetration. Huawei is widely used, even in Europe, in various European countries, in Asia. And in other countries around the world, as I said, 160 countries worldwide. It is the world's largest supplier of 5G, cutting-edge 5G infrastructure and products. The other Western competitors like Ericsson and Nokia and even Samsung are miles behind. But of course, up to now, where the worries about Huawei's background and the fear that its products may have backdoors, all these worries exist for a long, long time in the past. But up to now, there is no hard evidence that there is a backdoor.
Let's then bring in Richard at this point. Andrew does make a good point, doesn't he? How right is the US to be, first of all, suspicious of Huawei? Secondly, where is the evidence?
Well, let's just start. Laura, your opening package said that by law in China, competition against Huawei is not even permitted. So Huawei is trying to get access to the U.S. market when its U.S. counterparts are not able, as of now, to get access to the Chinese market. So right there, there's kind of an imbalance. And I think what you would hear from officials that started in the Pentagon, in the Defense Department in the United States, years ago, this was not just a Donald Trump fiction, that there were grave concerns that because of Huawei's penetration, that, for example, it might have the ability to disable U.S. military if there was ever a shooting war involving China, that it would have the ability to disable kind of mainstream communications in the United States, whether involving the government or not. This was a pretty grave concern. I can't tell you, nor can any of your guests tell you, whether there's a basis for that. Maybe if this lawsuit proceeds, the Pentagon will have to establish, you could understand why they would be reluctant to kind of put on public display what they do and don't know about Huawei's penetration, its backdoors, its capacity, because there's real competitive issues there. But I'm satisfied that they're not using this as a fiction to advance the Trump trade agenda. This preceded Donald Trump.
Okay. Mark, is there not a similar threat, though, or can people not use the similar argument against other companies? I mean, if we look at Apple or Samsung, I mean, with Apple, for example, there were indeed suspicions that the United States National Security Agency had installed some spyware. So if Huawei, then why not every technology company?
Well, I think that what's really underpinning this entire discussion is how critical 5G is going to be. 5G is not really going to be about smartphones in the grand scheme of things. It's going to be connecting and controlling all of our autonomous cars, drones, connected factories, smart cities. All of these things are going to go through this 5G network, which is a really big difference than what we saw with the 4G networks. And I think that is really what is underpinning all of these security fears that are out there, whether or not they're actually warranted.
Well, that's another interesting point, isn't it, Richard? This 5G network. Is the US not concerned that without using Huawei's product, because it is a leading developer in 5G, that it's going to fall behind the rest of the world when it comes to developing this super fast network?
I think by all accounts, that's very much a concern in the Trump White House, that the US is losing the 5G race. But I think, again, the concern about Huawei way predated all the talk and development of 5G. This went back many years, again, in the Pentagon, before 5G was kind of a dream that people had of being ubiquitous, and it looks like it will be. But I think that the officials in the U.S. government who are apolitical have a concern, and again, maybe they'll have to put the basis for their concerns on the record in the course of this lawsuit, that this has, yes, 5G is part of it, but it's more than 5G as regards Huawei.
Andrew, perhaps you can help explain to us what role the Communist Party plays in a company like Huawei, because all companies must have a Communist Party committee. What do they actually do?
I think that although the founder was from the PLA, but then the company has been established as an independent company. I mean, the background of a lot of the companies around the world have different backgrounds. But Huawei has made it absolutely clear that, of course, it holds the customers' interests at high regard. Otherwise, it would not have been able to achieve such a high level of market penetration in 160 countries worldwide. And not just because of its products, but because of the reliability of its services. Now, the concern about digital security does not apply to Huawei itself only. There are companies, even as you said, I mean, Apple, Google, and also other high-tech companies. They all have this kind of concerns. It is an international phenomenon. So Huawei has said during this press conference that it's willing to work with and continue to work with the international community and indeed governments to improve the kind of security issues associated with the digital products as well as infrastructure. And indeed, even amongst the so-called Five-Eyed Association, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom focusing on digital security. The United Kingdom has already said that, yes, of course, it shares some of the concerns, but it does not believe that banning Huawei outright is the answer. And obviously, the kind of concerns could be managed by different layers of security kind of infrastructure built into the system. So I think that this is the whole argument used by Huawei in taking the U.S. government to court. The kind of unilateral banning Huawei, not only in the United States, but worldwide, and even in countries which have got very little to do with national security. And the ban is under the so-called National Security Authorization Law of the United States. The United States acting as both judge, jury, and executioner without giving Huawei the chance to present its case through the courts is a violation of the separation of powers in the United States. And that's the gist of Huawei's lawsuit. And also, Huawei has also, in the press conference, highlighted the fact that Huawei products contain only about 30% of the components made by Huawei, And like many other products, there are components from all over the world.
Right.
And,
okay.
And these other components likewise will have security.
Mark,
and so targeting,
I'm just going to jump in there, Andrew, because the point about bringing other Western countries like Germany and the UK into the discussion is quite a personal one, isn't it? Because they are still deciding on what 5G restrictions to impose on Huawei, if indeed they impose any. Why are they hesitating where the US has not?
So I think there's a very clear reason why these companies are hesitating and why they have to hesitate. And that's because Huawei's infrastructure costs are typically 30% less than those of their competitors. And so, 5G does not necessarily even have a clear business case right now. Huawei and its other, sister company in China, ZTE, have always been much more lower cost providers of mobile network infrastructure. And I think especially in emerging markets and even in Europe, where there's a lot of competition, more competition than the US, these are very, very critical business concerns. And so I think that's why you've seen a lot of back and forth.
Richard, the UK does have this cybersecurity evaluation centre where it says it's quite happy being able to manage the security risk of Huawei products through this mechanism. Can that not be replicated in the US?
Well, again, what none of us know is what the officials in the United States government have seen that have given rise to their concern. Might it be something that is totally fictitious? Might it be as grave as they're insisting? We just don't know. And is it possible that what the UK says is manageable, in the opinion of the United States officials, is not? I mean, the fact is, with all due respect to the UK, the US has kind of a global reach, and I think their judgment in the United States government is its security apparatus is second to none. Might it reach the point where the United States can, like the UK, decide, all right, we can live with Huawei? Perhaps. But it's a concern to the United States because it's got, say, troops in the UK, troops in Germany, where there need to be communication lines. And frankly, they can't bypass Huawei as things stand now. So that's the concern. And again, we may not know until this litigation proceeds and there's discovery that both sides have to put their cards on the table, presumably in some non-public setting, so the U.S. government can satisfy a judge, look, judge, we're not making this up. Here's our basis for telling you why we have this concern. And so far, where there has been litigation that ZTE and Huawei have kind of pursued, the courts have generally been pretty receptive to the United States government position.
Okay, but you say that might not be in a public setting, so we might, as consumers, never know what the threat to the U.S. is.
What I'm saying is, and I was a law clerk, the top advisor to the top federal judge in the District of Columbia, in a case involving state secrets, where there had to be non-public hearings because that was something that the United States government needed to disclose to the judge to persuade him of why their position, in their view, took precedence over the opposing party. But it's not the kind of thing that you would want to share publicly. And so, yes, at the end of the day, like a lot of things having to do with high technology, it may well be that the public doesn't know every single detail. Ultimately, will they? Probably. But for purposes of kind of pursuing this litigation, maybe not.
Okay. Andrew, when we look at the case of the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, and her arrest in Canada, and we look at the Chinese government's reaction to that there were counter-arrests of Canadians in Canada. I mean, that was quite an extreme reaction to Meng's arrest, and it does only serve, doesn't it? It plays into this narrative that the Communist Party has high involvement with Huawei.
Well, I think that both China and the United States have made it clear that the arrest of this daughter of the founder of Huawei has got nothing to do with what the U.S. is doing in banning Huawei from various installations. That even the lawsuit according to the press conference just held in Shenzhen, the top leader of Huawei make it quite clear that the lawsuit has nothing to do with the arrest of the founder's daughter. But coming back to the Canadian case, the question before the Canadian courts is whether or not there are similar crimes which under the Canadian law exist that also exist in the United States. In other words, even if it's a crime in the United States, there must be a law in Canada embodying the same crime before the extradition request can be acceded to. And of course, ultimately, the courts will have to decide according to Canadian law. And even if the courts decide that the extradition should go ahead, that the Attorney General of Canada has got to make a final decision. And of course, throughout the process, there are many, many opportunities for appeal. So I think the case in Canada is likely to drag on for years. And some people say that this is the kind of the delaying tactics of Huawei. Well, this may well be. But I think that behind it all is a perception, at least in Beijing, that it is not just a trade war. It's not just a technology war. It's a 360-degree pushback against the rise of China, which is seen to be threatening the U.S. dominance in different fields. Now, don't forget, China helped to get into the WTO itself years ago with the hope that China would become more like the West. Right. But after all these years, this hope has been dashed.
Mark, would you agree with that? I'm going to jump in there, Andrew. Mark, would you agree with that? Many people do say that this US ban is just an attempt to keep the competitive edge of American companies.
I'm not quite sure I can say that because, I think one of the things we need to remember here is that a lot of the Huawei and ZTE equipment that is being shipped potentially to places like Iran or North Korea has a lot of American components in it, Intel chips, Qualcomm chips, all sorts of things. America does not have a wireless radio infrastructure player. And so, bringing down Huawei is not necessarily propping up any U.S. company. And in fact, a lot of U.S. Chip makers are very important suppliers to Huawei. So I think, of course, there are very large geopolitical issues here that are probably underpinning all of this. But there isn't, the companies like Motorola and Bell Labs and Lucent they're all long gone. So, yeah, that is a concern, but I'm not necessarily sure that it's driving an agenda.
OK. Richard, how should Huawei reassure governments like the US over the concerns that they have?
Well, let me just mention one thing, just for purpose of your viewers. Here we're talking about the transparency of the Canadian court system and the U.S. court system. There's some hope that if this litigation proceeds, if Huawei is satisfied that it poses no threat, it will have to basically prove that. And the United States government will have to prove something quite differently. Think about what the likelihood is if this was a court case in China. Think about that for a second. Who would have confidence that this would be handled on the up and up, that the same level of transparency would obtain in a Chinese court if Huawei was a litigant as opposed to the United States? That's one of the fundamental problems. We're kind of talking about systems that are radically different. So again, to answer your question, I think Huawei will have to produce documents and have witnesses and subject them to cross-examination in a United States court to basically satisfy a court here that it's, it poses no threat. The United States government will have to put on the table its evidence to the contrary, and then a judge will have to make a determination, and ultimately that will be reviewed by a court of appeals and maybe ultimately the Supreme Court. But again, that's the value. That's what the United States. That's why the United States has to be preeminent, not just on this case, but in the world, because it's got certain levels of transparency, and its court system is something that is open to everybody. I don't think anybody would say that's, as of now, the case in the Chinese courts.
OK, well, it's certainly going to be a fascinating legal battle. Hopefully, we will, as the public, be privy to some of it. Many thanks to all of our gentlemen, our guests, for joining us here today. Andrew Leung, Richard Goodstein and Marc Einstein. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.